So now, of course, Thanksgiving is over, and we have Christmas firmly in sight, right? Who started their Christmas shopping already? Anybody? Wow, a few of you keen people. It's like the 23rd, that's soon enough, isn't it? Of December, that is, not November. And you know, your mission is, right, to get out and find a present, right, that will do, not just like do, but maybe, hopefully, actually touch the person that you are giving it to, right? What touches you this morning? When is the last time you really felt touched by something? How do you know when something touches you? When something really connects with you? Of course, Christmas is coming, in case you hadn't realized that. And we were having a little discussion back there in the media table around about when Christmas songs and music should start be playing. And I am very much in the minority here, I can tell, because I firmly believe that it should not start in November, but each their own. But, you know, Christmas songs and music, they do touch us, don't they? Next month, we're taking our granddaughter to see the Nutcracker here in Portland. You know, so there's a story and music that has touched people down through the generations. And maybe, like, I expect some of you on Friday were touched by some sports activity, right? And maybe others of you not touched in quite the way that you had hoped. Life touches us, doesn't it? And stories of life touch us. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Life touches us. What would you like to be touched by this morning? You know, here we are at a Sunday gathering, right? And we want to be touched by Jesus, don't we? But how would you know if you've been touched by Jesus? How would that make you feel exactly? Would you laugh? Would you cry? Would you do a backflip? Or would you just remain unmoved? How do you know if Jesus has truly touched your life, or if you have indeed reached out and touched him? Well, we're continuing on in our series, God Questions, this morning, in which God asks people various questions, right? Not because he doesn't know the answer. He does know the answer, but he wants to touch the lives of the people that he's talking to, and vicariously through them, he wants to touch our lives too. And this morning we're going to look at a question that Jesus asked, which is kind of an odd question, as we'll see. And he asks, who touched me? And it's a really important question for all of us actually to answer. Let's see if we're able to come forward when Jesus asks that question. Luke chapter 8, we're going to read verse 40 through 56. Now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the people pressed around him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd surrounds you and are pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." And while he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well." And when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James and the father and mother of the child. And all were weeping and mourning for her, but he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up at once. And he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents were amazed, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. You know, we find that clip from Up so moving because it's so relatable, isn't it? It shows incidents of life. Maybe we haven't experienced all of those incidents ourselves, but we can relate to it because we know the ups and downs of life, the gains and the losses, the touches of joy, the touches of sadness and despair, of hope and loneliness and companionship. We can relate to all of those things in life, can't we? And why does Jesus touch so many people? You know, one of my favorite Christmas music, although it's not actually Christmas music, is Handel's Messiah. And a few years ago I got the privilege to see it in London, and a 17th century church performed, and it was touched my soul deeply. Not just because of the atmosphere, but because of the music and the words. You know, when you put music and words together, and especially words about the life of Jesus Christ, that touches me so deeply. Because we can relate to Jesus because he came from heaven to earth. That's such a remarkable thing, you know. We just kind of talk about it. Oh yeah, Jesus came down from heaven from earth. The God who created all the universe spoke everything into creation with a word, right? He came down to live on it and be part of it. That's an incredible, incredible thing. Leslie and I, a few weeks ago, we went to Rome to see our youngest son, who's doing a study abroad thing over there. And of course, you know, it would be really wrong of us and bad of us to go to Rome and not see some of the sights while we're there, right? Which is kind of hard not to see, because every corner you go around, there's something more to see, you know? And, coming from England, I think some stuff is pretty old in England, but Rome is a way different level. You know, everything is like 2,000 years old. And if you like history and you like good food, I'll tell you, Rome is the place to be. It is a great, great place. And of course, we went to see the Colosseum, right? And I was all over that, and I texted my grandson and a picture of the Colosseum and a quote from Gladiator, right? And as well, I was talking to Leslie about this, and do you know what I discovered about my wife? I did not know this. She has never seen Gladiator. I was like, how did I not know this before we got married? And the tour guide told us, right, well, you should stop and touch the stones of the Colosseum. It's built out of this travertine limestone. And it was a hot autumn day, but the stones were cool. And I guess it's porous, right? So it's absorbed all the environment for 2,000 years. And that's wonderful and amazing, but I didn't feel touched by it particularly, right? In fact, I didn't really feel touched by most of the sites there, as wonderful and fantastic as they were. And yes, I gained a whole new appreciation of Roman skills and abilities and knowledge. And, you know, we think we're so great today. Yeah, we're not, you know. And took loads of photos, and I'd be happy to bore you to death, you know, by showing them to you if you really wanted to. But I was looking at all that stuff, you know, and so many of those buildings were built to worship gods who never came down to earth, who never touched people and their lives. because only one God has done that, and his name is Jesus Christ. And that thought touched me, that all the while those Romans were building those big buildings to temples, to false gods, there was Jesus walking in a faraway little spot of the Roman Empire, touching people's lives. And he continues 2,000 years later to touch people's lives. He touches us through his Spirit, through his word. And he should be touching us through his church as well, right? But the question is, do we want to touch him? Not in the way that it's kind of a tourist attraction. Oh yeah, that was Jesus 2,000 years ago. But in a way in which we want to feel power coming out of Jesus and changing our lives. Luke starts off this story by telling us that Jesus had returned from the other side and the crowds were waiting for him. But where had Jesus been? Well, the night before he got in this boat and with his disciples, and he said, we're going across the other side of the lake to the Decapolis region, which is kind of an odd thing because that's a Gentile area over there. But nonetheless, the disciples didn't really ask. They just got in the boat with Jesus. Little did they know that they were about to enter into the storm of their lives, right? And Jesus, in the midst of this storm, was asleep in the boat. And they didn't just touch Jesus, they took hold of Jesus and shook him and woke him. And don't you care that we're all about to go, it's curtains for us? And Jesus, with a word, stills the storm, and they're afraid. But they get to the other side, and Jesus steps out on the shore, and he's greeted by this man who is in a shocking state, because he's inhabited by this legion of demons, hundreds, thousands maybe, of demons. And yet Jesus, although this man could even be a Gentile, right, has come from one side of the lake, he's traveled all the way over the other side of the lake, specifically to touch this man's life, to cast these demons out of this man and set him free. That's how much Jesus cares about touching people. The demons, of course, he casts them out. They go into this herd of pigs nearby. The pigs down the hillside, over the cliff, into the sea, and all pigs don't go to heaven, unfortunately. But the herdsmen, right, they're now unemployed, so they leg it back into the town, and they tell the townspeople about what's happened, and the townspeople come out to see what has taken place, and they don't like Jesus' touch. And they ask Jesus to leave before he touches anything else of theirs. Sometimes other people around us realize the implications of Jesus' touch on life better than we do sometimes. And that when Jesus does touch our lives, it can come at a cost, right? That we might lose our pigs as well, or whatever else it is that we have. What we have might hold dear might end up at the bottom of the sea too, right? And we don't really want Jesus to touch our lives quite in that way where that kind of power comes out. And the most frightening part of that story is when the people ask Jesus to leave, he actually leaves. He gets back in the boat and he goes away. If you don't want Jesus to touch your life, he'll leave your life untouched. But you might want to think about the implications of that. The man who'd been possessed by the demons, of course, naturally, he wants to go with Jesus, right? He doesn't want to be left with these people that care more about pigs than him. But Jesus tells him he can't go, that he needs to go and tell others, his friends and family, about what God has done to him. And he goes back and he tells his family and friends about how Jesus has touched his life. That's really one way, isn't it, that we can tell whether Jesus has touched our lives or not, is whether we want to tell other people about that. Because if Jesus has really touched our lives with power, we want to see those friends and family and everyone around us touched in the same way with Jesus' power. So we're going to tell people about that. So Jesus comes back to Galilee, and what's he going to find back on his home side of the lake? Anyone desperate there to touch Jesus? Well, he does find someone who has, number one, an unpretentious touch. The crowds are waiting for him, but one person is particularly waiting for him. You know, in Rome, not only is there like the ancient Roman stuff, right? But of course, there's a ton of Christian sites to see too. I mean, historically, it's a Christian place, you know. Paul was there, you know, Peter was there. They both died there. You can go and see St. Peter's Square and Basilica and the Vatican museums and all this stuff, the Sistine Chapel, which is stunning, frankly. I mean, Michelangelo spent, 9 years painting that? And the architecture, art, it's all stunning, on the scale and grandeur. And thousands of visitors go there, right? But are they touched by Jesus? I think many had gone out to see Jesus when he returned from across the lake. But for most, Jesus was just a tourist attraction, right? To go out, maybe they'd heard about him from friends or someone. Oh, you should, if you get the chance, right, and have the time, you should go and see this chap Jesus, because sometimes he does some pretty amazing things. And, you know, and so they went out to see who this Jesus was, and maybe he'd do something amazing, and maybe they, you know, if they had their camera up and ready, they get a good picture to bring back. But Jesus never touched most of those lives, did he? Because they never reached out to touch him. Their lives remained untouched by his power. And many people think like that today, don't they? Life is just going along fine and dandy, and I don't need Jesus' touch in my life because I have it all under control. And before I criticize people like that too much, I do the same thing too. Day by day, you know. I nominally get up and read my devotional and pray, but do I really reach out and touch Jesus through his word and through prayer? Or do I really think, well, actually, I've kind of got this day by myself, right? And I don't really need to access Jesus' power into my life. How often do we really reach out and touch Jesus to access his power? Chances are we don't really do that, do we? Until something bad happens, and it's sometimes, you know, the day is not going the way that I planned it to go, and then maybe I'll reach out and touch Jesus. You know, we don't know much about Jairus, really, do we? Except he was a religious leader, he was respected, he was morally upright, he kept the rules and regulations, and probably he was reasonably well off, you know, and life was going along just fine, right, for Jairus, until his daughter got sick. And again, you know, I'm going to conjecture here a little bit, but maybe it wasn't too bad to start with, and they thought she'll be all right, you know. But she steadily got worse, and they call the doctor, and the doctor, you know, gives her some medicine. She'll be all right in a couple of days, but she's not, and it gets worse and worse and worse, and they're praying for her healing. And the answer to her healing is to get Jesus to come and touch her. And clearly, Jairus does hope that Jesus has the touch of healing. But would Jesus come to Jairus' house, right? Because Jairus, he is a religious leader, and you know how Jesus feels about religious leaders. He generally is pretty unimpressed by them all, right? And who knows what Jairus had been, you know, had he been in opposition to Jesus? I mean, we don't know all this. But what we do know is clearly now he is desperate for Jesus' touch in his daughter's life. So off he goes to find Jesus as soon as he hears that Jesus has come back. And what does he do? Does he come before Jesus? I'm a religious leader, you know, you need to come because of who I am. No, he doesn't, does he? He throws himself down before Jesus, and he pleads for Jesus to come and touch his daughter's life. He is completely unpretentious in his plea for Jesus to come. So how do we come before Jesus this morning? Do we throw ourselves down before his throne of grace and mercy? Not because we're this or because we're that, but because we are desperate for Jesus to touch us with his power. Peter tells us, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Do you come before Jesus this morning with an unpretentious touch? Second touch that Luke tells us about is an undaunted touch. So Jesus agrees to go, and you can only just really imagine Jairus' relief, right? Come on, Jesus, come on. And progress is kind of slow because the crowds are pushing in, and suddenly Jesus stops. And he asks this question: who touched me? I thought of this passage when we were going through the Vatican museums. I mean, it is so crowded in here. The guy told us that 40,000 people a day go through the Vatican museums. And there's so much stuff to see, and of course most of it's roped off, and you're not allowed to touch it, and even if you wanted to touch it, the crowd just pushes you along. You couldn't touch it anyway, right? And there are guards there keeping a wary eye open in case anyone does get the wrong idea and wants to try and reach out and touch anything. And Luke, being a doctor himself, he likes to talk about the medical conditions, right? This woman had a problem. It's not a life-threatening problem, but it is a problem, right? And it kind of ruins her quality of life. Physically, it ruins it. Discomfort, but ritually also too, because she is permanently unclean. She's a kind of an outcast. And she's tried to get help over the years, and she's been to different doctors to see different specialists, but none have been able to help her, and she's exhausted her savings. And now she's out of options, and Jesus is her last hope. And again, we might criticize her for saying, well, Jesus should be your first hope, right? Not your last hope. But we do that too. And again, that's not to say that we shouldn't use doctors and medicine, because we should, because God works through all of that too. But Jesus must be our first hope through it all. And this woman, she thinks that if she can just reach out and touch the hem of Jesus' clothing, maybe she will be healed. And you can kind of imagine, right? There's that crowd, and they're just pushing around Jesus, and she shouldn't really be there, but she is. And maybe she thinks, oh, I'm never going to get there. And then suddenly there's an opening, and this is her chance, and she can just reach out and touch Jesus and disappear and never be noticed. And that will be the end of that. I've been reflecting, theologically speaking, since our trip to Rome. And one reflection is just the number of obstacles that religion puts around Jesus. Rituals, artifacts, stuff, just all built up around Jesus. Kind of barriers, really, that prevent people from getting to Jesus. Stuff that really has nothing to do with Jesus whatsoever. And we need to be really careful as Christians, as a church, that we don't put anything in the way of people who want to reach out and touch Jesus. Politics, nationalism, all that kind of stuff. That has no place in keeping people from reaching Jesus. And yet, despite all these barriers that are placed around Jesus, people are still able to reach out and touch him, aren't they? And access his power and touch him in a way that Jesus himself notices. And it's an undaunted touch, right? That despite all the obstacles, despite all of that, if you're determined to reach out and touch Jesus, he will let you. When Jesus stopped and asked, who touched me. There were only two people in this crowd that knew what Jesus was talking about. Jesus and the woman. Peter was like, what are you talking about? We're in the Vatican here, and there's 40,000 people pushing all around you, right? And we're doing our best, Jesus. You know, you can imagine the disciples like around Jesus, trying to keep people away, but all to no avail. But Jesus knows that this is a different kind of touch, right? Because he feels that power has gone out of him. And the woman, she knew instantly that power had gone out of him because it had come into her and healed her. And maybe her plan had been to slip away unnoticed, but now she couldn't. And so she comes forward and she's frightened, she's scared because she's a woman and she shouldn't have touched Jesus, and she's an unclean woman and she certainly shouldn't have touched Jesus. And what's Jesus going to say, right? And trembling, she falls down before her, and Jesus tells her, daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace. Her undaunted touch has received God's power. And Jesus was also reinstating her back into public life, right? This woman is clean. She is healed. She doesn't need to hide away anymore in shame. She can come out and live the life that God had created for her. You know, when we reach out and touch Jesus in undaunted faith, he sends out his power to cleanse us, to heal us. And no longer do we need to hide away in secrecy and shame. One time the disciples were trying to stop parents from bringing their children to receive Jesus' touch. And Jesus said to them, let the children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. For truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter into it. Do you have an undaunted touch this morning? Thirdly, do you have an untiring touch? Because while Jesus is sorting out all this business about who touched him, messengers come from Jairus' house to say that don't bother bringing Jesus to your house anymore because your daughter's dead. But Jesus tells the man, don't fear, only believe, and she will be well. You know, I'm glad we got to see these sites in Rome. Well, some of them. I mean, you need weeks to see all of them there. And maybe someday we'll get back and see some more. I don't know. I'd like to do that. But we live in a finite world, don't we? Time and space. And there comes a time, you know, like in Up with Carl and Ellie, where it's too late, right? We might have the plans to go and do this and that, but at some point, death will intervene. And if only they had acted sooner. And I wonder what was going through Jairus' mind. Can you imagine that, right? He was so desperate for Jesus to come and touch his daughter before it was too late and the progress was slow. And then Jesus stops and, you know, we're never going to make it, and then we're never going to make it because it's too late. And this woman, you know, she doesn't have any life-threatening disease. Surely you can just deal with her later, right? After you've touched my daughter, because that's much more pressing. She's dying. But Jesus tells him it's not too late. Only believe. Now, I don't think that means that if Jairus believes, right, that his daughter is alive and well, she will be alive and well. It doesn't rest on Jairus' faith, right, in that regard. What it rests on is Jairus' faith in Jesus. Because Jesus is not confined to time and space. Sometimes, right, we pray for God's touch with great urgency too, don't we? We have a situation, or we have a health problem, or a relationship, or a dream, and there's a deadline attached to that. Something is dying before our eyes, and we want Jesus to come and touch it before it's too late. But then the text flashes, and don't bother. It died. And sometimes it really is dead, right? And it's time to move on and do something else. And like David, you may remember, his son was dying and he was fasting and praying, and then his son died and his servants were scared to tell him, and David was like, well, that's that, time to move on, right? Because our untiring faith is in God. It's in Jesus, not in whether he particularly answers our prayer one way or another. And sometimes Jesus answers prayers in a way that we weren't expecting, right? I mean, the whole story of Up is that Carl thought his life was over when Ellie died, but in fact, he was just opening up to a new chapter in life with Russell, wasn't he? And God does that in our lives. Jesus had a friend, Lazarus, and he died. Despite the fact that his sisters had sent messages to Jesus, Jesus did not come in time. And when Jesus finally did show up, Martha, Lazarus' sister, rushed out to meet Jesus and said, "Oh, Jesus, if only you had been here." And then she said something really curious. "But even now, I know whatever you ask God, he will do it for you." What she exactly meant by that is hard to know. But Jesus started to draw it out of her. And she affirms, right, that yes, I believe in the resurrection, that the dead will rise. But Jesus says to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? In other words, do you have untiring touch? And Martha did, because she said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." It's one of the great professions of faith in the New Testament. How about you? Do you have an untiring touch on Jesus this morning? And lastly, we need to talk about Jesus' unprecedented touch. He arrives at Jairus' house. There are all the mourners there. Jesus tells them she's not dead, she's just sleeping, but they know a dead body when they see one, and they laugh at him, so he puts them all out, just as 3 disciples and the parents, and he takes her by the hand and touches her. And she comes back to life. And everyone, can you imagine how deeply touched you would have been if you'd been there to see that? I'll tell you one of the places in Rome that did touch me, and it's kind of a funny place. And that was at one of the catacombs that we went to visit. And the catacombs in Rome are this was a 2-acre plot, and there were 40,000 people buried there in this 2-acre plot. And because they would bury people and they kind of stack them up, right? And then when they ran out of room, they dig down below and stack some more down there, right? And literally, you went through these tunnels 20 to 30 feet underground, and just rows of tombs on either side, right? In the kind of gloomy darkness, damp darkness. And, they were all kind of empty because all the bodies have decomposed many, many years ago. And you might think, well, Bryan, that's an odd place to feel touched, right, in the middle. But we came across this one tomb, and it was probably someone who was fairly wealthy, because this tomb had been painted. This tomb is 1,700 years old, 300 AD. And it had a picture of Jesus. And his 12 disciples, 6 on one side and 6 on the other side. And it had the Chi and the Rho, which are the first 2 Greek letters for Christ's name. And it had the Alpha and the Omega. And there were some more paintings and signs. And what it indicated was this person's hope in the resurrection. That Jesus was going to return. And Jesus was going, when he returned, he would touch their body and it would be made new. And what touched me is that is my hope too. As I was looking at this grape, this person and me, we have the same hope in Jesus Christ. That he is going to touch us, even though we're dead, with an unprecedented touch, not to resuscitate us, but to resurrect us, right? After Jesus' resurrection, he appeared to his disciples, but one of them wasn't there, Thomas, right? And Thomas came back, and his disciples were all excited. And, oh, Thomas, mate, you should have been here. Jesus was here. You know, it's so exciting, isn't it? And Thomas said, no, not really. I don't believe you. Unless I touch, right? And 8 days later, Jesus comes back, and Thomas is there. And Jesus says, hey, Thomas, here, look, holes in my hands. Put your fingers in, touch. Holes in my side. Put your hand in, touch. Just believe, don't disbelieve. And Thomas says, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. And that's the unprecedented touch that we have our hope in this morning, isn't it? That Jesus will resurrect us. And he invites us to touch and see, to examine, and not to disbelieve, but to believe. So how is your touch here this morning? When have you last reached out and touched Jesus? Not just like touched him, but really reached out to touch him, to feel his power flow through you. Let's just consider that now. We're going to sing a song. Walter's going to come up and play. And just invite you to think about Jesus' touch in your life. How he's touched you. And if you've never asked Jesus to touch you, if you've never asked Jesus to fill you with his power, now would be a great time to do so. And you don't need to worry about any rituals or artifacts or anything like that. You just need to simply ask him. And he will touch you.